Welcome to TechVets The Podcast, a show dedicated to exploring the world of tech and cybersecurity through the eyes of industry leaders and ex-forces personnel. In this show, I'm talking to Rebellion Defence's Alex Burton, a former Admiral, and I start by asking him how a degree in chemistry helped when he joined the Royal Navy.
Well, I suppose, I'm quite old now. When I joined the Navy in 1986 as a graduate, I think there were only about 20% of young naval officers were graduates. So I suppose it was rather unusual then, though not unique. Now it's pretty standard that most people that join from civilian street, we get a lot of officers coming through from the ranks or the lower deck, as we describe it. But it was more unusual to have a degree in those days than it is now. Chemistry degree, you touch on an element of guilt in as I look through my life, because I wanted to join the Navy from sort of, mid-teens. I was in the cadets, so had the experience of life at sea a little from sailing and a couple of times on a warship. So I was sponsored as a bursar through university, which meant at the end of that time, so long as I got a degree, I was able to continue a career. That meant that I didn't commit to my degree as much as, in hindsight, I wish I had. And I suppose what it did give me, because I'm an eternal optimist in these things, what it did give me was a latter day enthusiasm for learning at the various staff courses I went on and the various other courses I went on. But I did not gain everything out of my academic education at Durham that I should have had, but I had a fabulous time.
Is the difference between now and then that people enter the Royal Navy slightly older now than they did in those days? I mean, 20 years before you, they were entering at the age of 15, weren't they, or 14?
Gosh, not that old. I don't think I'm that old, but yes, you're right. I think, although we might lag, the military tends to reflect society, and I think we're now at 50% or close to 50% of those people leaving school at the age of 18 go on to higher education. So it is a reflection of that. It's also a reflection, I think, across all three services of the need for greater grounding in education before they join, and a more sophisticated thinking. I would say we reflect society in the technology that we use, the challenges that we're engaged in, benefit from a degree. I mean, it's not necessary, and we've got some absolutely outstanding people that have joined either through the lower deck or straight from school. And forgive me, I keep saying we. Of course, I'm 3 years out of date. But once you've worn the uniform for so long, you feel a sense of belonging.
You'll never shake being Admiral, I'm afraid. Which is a wonderful thing. I've got a neighbour who was in the Royal Navy when they gave up on the tot of grog in the 1970s, which seems to be almost Napoleonic. And his son has just left Sandhurst at the age of 28, which for me seems extremely old. I mean, is that a sort of direction of travel for the whole of the military?
I think I take it more broad than that, which is I think the direction of travel will be and should be a far more fluid movement between the military and the civilian sector. And that might be people joining late with a whole host of skill sets that they've got from a previous career. It might be, and here's a vision and hope that others share, people dipping out of the services, going into other career paths, and then coming back in again and bringing the richness that they gain from the civilian sector. So, I wish the son of your friend well, and I'd hope that the experiences that he's had up until the age of 28 will serve as an additive to his military career when he leaves Sandhurst.
Well, I think that's the idea, isn't it? I'm very intrigued by this idea of dipping out of the services, going into the private sector. I mean, would that be in kind of specific pathways, specific contracts, certain industries, or would you sort of see a kind of sabbatical system for serving personnel?
Institutions love processes and structure. And so, your question sort of dips to what the military would like, which is a clear idea of a sabbatical or a leave of absence. I think the civil service have that at the moment. I'd be far more reactionary, rebellious perhaps, which is, we're a small enough organisation now that you should treat every individual and instance on its merits. So, for instance, we've a Royal Air Force 2-star who's joining us on a fellowship for 9 months between his 2 appointments. And, I'm hoping that he will gain a huge amount from his experience there. But equally, I could see a situation where a young software engineer or engineer joined a company like us for 2-3 years, left the Navy or the Air Force or the Army, and then after 2-3 years said, do you know what, actually, I want to use those skills within the cyber force or whatever. So went back in again. So I'd avoid being prescriptive on the mechanisms for movement between those two sectors.
It will inevitably be called Burton's AWOL scheme, won't it?
Well, no, it won't. I'm not. Look, this is not revolutionary, and it's not not just my idea. I think that Mike Wigston, the Chief of the Air Staff, when he gave his visionary look at the Air Force in 2040, had described this concept. I suppose the only thing that I would say is let's not wait till then. There's an impatience on both sides to make those changes now. So no, do not credit me with this, but I'm all for it.
Going back to your own experience in the Royal Navy, and it sounds like the bits where you went and learnt, where you went and did courses were really important to you. I don't know if you know what those courses are like now, but you're starting in the 1980s and through the 1990s. Did you get a sense that was becoming more important in the Royal Navy, where the courses adapting to modern times? Were you learning at the start quite traditional, out-of-date things, really?
I think the first thing I'd say is that what really energized me about my time in the Royal Navy was the variety, and there was that sort of balance between lifelong learning and personal development and getting on and doing stuff. But to go to your question on learning was very traditional. I think, unfortunately, it remains. COVID, let's come back to how COVID has probably acted as a forcing function for change. But were it not for COVID, so looking back 18 months ago, the manner of learning remains frustratingly traditional. And let's hope that COVID is, as I've said, acting as a forcing function for change there. I think what is being learned is developing all the time. And there are some really great people within the Defence Academy, within the Single Service Training Institutions that are driving the what. If I had a frustration, it would be, and I wrote about it recently with the Tony Blair Institute, it's quite extraordinary that I think, 20% of our military cohort are in training at any one time. That is, for the nation, a tragically high number in terms of efficiency.
20% is a high number in terms of efficiency. Surely training, given that they are not doing the kind of last resort thing they're supposed to be doing, isn't too terrible, is it? Isn't it?
No. Well, I think it depends on what you call what you describe as training. If it's a collection of warships or a battle group on Canada, Kenya, or Salisbury Plain, then no, I agree. I need to come back to you with the exact percentage. I think the reality is it's a large double-digit number in a classroom, and that has got to be wrong. So far more. I think there should be far more distant learning. There should be far more simulation. That, after all, is the environment that the youngsters of today are growing up in.
There's a big exercise off Scotland at the moment, isn't it? Is that the kind of training you'd prefer to see?
My worry about a big exercise off Scotland or a big exercise in Canada or Kenya is it has its place because you feel the wassit of the environment, but it falls short in several areas in that it probably, I know, it does not test against the environment that we will be fighting when we're taking on a peer adversary, because you are stuck within the confines of the Sea of Hebrides or out into elements of the North Atlantic. You are not, and nor are the capabilities that are trained against you in that environment the true capabilities that you will be put up against. So it falls short in some ways in measuring the adversary. But I think there is another point as well, which is with live training, you're unable to halt, look at how things went, retrain so that you get continuous improvement, and you're unable to experiment quite as effectively as you would in a synthetic environment. So I would like to see, and we talked about, there are two parts of training here. We talked about the classroom training, which needs to change, but I will also suggest that the sort of the group training needs to shift its balance into the virtual world as well, because of all the benefits that can come from that. That's not to say the live environment should be excluded, but the balance is too heavily weighted towards the live environment at the moment.
Okay, so you're in a lift with the Secretary of State for Defence, and you've just got a couple of flaws to say, pragmatically speaking, how do you roll out a new programme of education for the armed forces? What would you do?
I'd split it in two. I'd say individual training needs to be far more engaging. It needs to be distant and needs to be connected to the equipment and the systems that they're using and moved out of the classroom. And, take advantage of all of the technology that is available at the moment for augmented reality, et cetera. And they're stepping towards that, but that needs to be accelerated. And then I would look at what I would describe as the tactical and operational training. And I would say that for so many reasons, that the balance of tactical and operational training needs to shift into the synthetic environment, because you get a more testing and more credible environment against your peer adversaries. You get the ability to retrain and learn from your mistakes and get debriefs. You get the ability to experiment, and you probably protect your assets, those live assets, more by not throwing them around in substandard training environments.
Lovely. Ping, you're at floor 15. You've done it. I think that makes a lot of sense. Your own background, chemistry was a degree, but did the Royal Navy pick that up at any stage and say, you should be on a chemistry course, you should be doing something chemical, or were you allowed to forge your own path?
I certainly wasn't allowed to forge my own path. I was guided and had a collection of mentors and people who told me where to go on occasions. Interestingly, I think one of the people that I did a degree with I was up in the northeast of England. One was in Wales, and he did a mining degree. I think that was even less relevant to the Royal Navy than a chemistry degree. But it brings me to the point, and I think this is where we're enriched by the large number of graduates, which is that what a degree gives you is an inquisitive mind, a disciplined mind, and one would hope a lifelong thirst for knowledge. And I think that's what I got, in part because I didn't exploit the opportunities as I should have done. But that's what I got from my degree.
Good. Okay. I want to go on to your recent work for Rebellion and Tony Blair Institute. But let's cover the end of your career with the Royal Navy, where there were cuts mooted. You were named in an article as you were about to resign because of the cuts. Was this politics? Did you get caught up in the politics of the situation?
No, I never felt forced to resign by being pushed by my leaders. It was a personal choice, and it was a personal choice that had a whole host of context playing into it, one of which was a desire, in a rather trite manner, to spend more time with my family, but in a very true sense. One of which was a desire to try something very different. And of course, there were a variety of other things within my current career that also made me think, it's time to move on, and time to move on with a huge gratitude for the enormous amount that the Navy had given me and offered me.
Was any part of it the kind of horrifying media pressure that comes with the job of Admiral? You were picked up shortly before that in a Richard Littlejohn column, weren't you, for being pro-LGBTQ, which he doesn't like at all?
That's a really good question, which I suppose I can answer in two parts. There was no way that criticism was a catalyst for me leaving the Navy. To some extent, proud is the wrong word, but I have no regrets for the manner. I do remember waking up in the morning, perhaps naively, but somewhat shocked both at the article. I had overwhelming notes of sympathy, which I didn't need, and support, which was hugely helpful. Well, an old university friend of mine was running a PR sort of polling organization and said, look, least I can do is help to see how your brand and, for want of a better word, your brand and reputation has been affected. And he phoned me back, having sent me a bit of data 3 days later, and said, you got a polling rate that Kim Jong-un would be proud of. In terms of has it done you any damage, Burton? The answer is no. All of us make decisions, and sometimes we think we made them in haste and regret them. And sometimes we think we make them in haste and we don't regret them. And I think on that one, I made it in haste. And, I recognize that that's part of my personality, which I need to temper. But it's one of those ones that I have no regret on.
I've got a Royal Navy friend who was rather cruelly describing a First Sea Lord as an absolutely excellent person to have alongside you if you're fighting a war, but don't stand between him and a broadcast interview or you'll get run over. It sounds like you weren't very, not media savvy, that's the wrong word. You didn't court the media, did you?
Well, that must be for others to form a view on, because I think that courting the media is one of what others perceive you to do. I would say that, and things have changed significantly, I would say that I had a frustration that Defence's approach to the media was, and it is less so now, but we're talking 3 to 6 years ago, was one of defensive circle the wagons. And I always thought that was the wrong approach to make. And it was far better to have an engaged approach with the media and have a conversation. Now, there are clearly areas that are off bounds, and that is quite right.
Good. Now, since you have left, can you describe your career? What have you done?
Yeah, a lot of fun. And I think that should be how everyone looks back and looks forward at any career. It should be something that provides energy for you, rather than makes your heart sink when you either go to your desk in your study or catch the bus into work. I mean, actually, going to your point of why I left the Navy because I was seduced out of the Navy. A good friend of mine who I've known since I was 6 months old worked for Deloitte and did some pro bono work for small startup companies with a purpose. And I was talking to him about that at some stage over the next few years, I would leave, and what were his thoughts. And he threw me a business pack for this young company and said, look, this is a really exciting organization. They've just started up. They're delivering some extraordinary stuff in Africa. I'm interested in it because my wife's Tanzanian and this was my friend, and they're delivering water in Africa. They probably need someone with a little bit of military discipline and structure around them. Would you like me to introduce you? And he did. And within literally having been introduced to them in September, I had left my job in the Navy 2 months later and was supporting them. So if you wind back to your earlier question, why did you leave? I was pulled to a really exciting young company that was doing some exceptional stuff.
And to pick up what you were saying about making your career work for you, perhaps not, which means not looking for the money all the time. If you're a serving military personnel who's looking at tech vets to find a job in tech, that would be your advice to them: is don't think to yourself this is all about salary. Don't think this is all about being crammed into a box and made to do something for the rest of your life. Make sure that what you're doing is good for you.
Yes, I in some ways, as an admiral, you're very lucky in that you've got a whole host of connections. You've got a household name in some sectors, and the other key thing is you do have the safety net of a pension. So I don't take any of that In other ways, it's a real burden because people expect you to demand a staff car, a collection of outer office individuals and pampering. I mean, absolutely not with this fabulous little company. I mean, I remember going out to Malaysia, I think it was just before I left the Navy, representing the First Sea Lord, and was unbelievably well looked after because of who I was representing from the moment I sort of left the aircraft to the moment I was returned to the aircraft, and it was quite fabulous. My next flight was out to Tanzania with this small company. We were taking in, I think, the first 40 of these products that we were putting into villages. I, flew into in the middle of the night, gone in some sort of overcrowded taxi to go and stay in a sort of shared room in a hostel. And within 2 nights, I was literally sleeping in a mud hut, 5 hours from 3-4 hours from the nearest road. And that was the world of the 18 months. So you've got to leave all of the accoutrements of power behind you and be prepared to learn again, and have the humility.
You don't travel everywhere by frigate then. That's good to hear. Let's go to the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, because that is as branded a position, I suppose, as the word Admiral, isn't it? I mean, people have an expectation of what that means. What do you do for them, and how does it being the Tony Blair Institute help?
I mean, I wouldn't overstate what I do with them to start with, but the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change has a fellowship that it set up last year under the banner of technology and public policy. And I mean, I think it was, why was I interested in it? Because I just saw it of its time. So this was set up before COVID. And I think that, if COVID has taught us anything, it is that technology is going to be, the critical path and science is going to be the critical path of our future. But it was set up before then to get a group of people to think about how technology can facilitate public policy and public change. And interestingly, when I joined in the autumn, the piece of work, and I was asked, we as fellows were asked to do a couple of articles over a year. And the question that I posed, which I still have in my mind unanswered, is how, as increasingly we use artificial intelligence, as increasingly we use data to support our decision making, how do we enable the strategic thinkers, the policy makers, to use data? Because the alternative is that those strategic leaders and policy makers use data that is for tactical decision making and time-bound decision making, and they don't become the strategic leaders and the policy drivers that we would want. So my worry was that in that sort of rather, if I could sort of use a rather trite metaphor, the sort of film The Eye in the Sky, where you've got all the strategic deciders sitting around a full motion video feed tracking someone. The risk is that the same thing happens with data. You have our strategic thinkers and our politicians focused on what might happen over the next year or so, because that's what they can measure, and lose the ability for vision and distance. So that's what I was going to write on. And as we moved into COVID, the fellowship looked quite rightly at how elements of technology with COVID. And I sort of jumped ship a little because that wasn't within my skill set, and said I would offer some support on how the Ministry of Defence, as it looked, and government, as it looked to the integrated review, should deliver technology on the back of that review. So I tried not to offer pointers on too much as to what they should change, but preferred to focus on okay, once they've decided, how ambitious should they be? How could the government drive that ambition?
That's a very interesting, complicated, technical answer. And a couple of things kind of spring out of it for me. And perhaps it'd be useful to use Eye in the Sky as an example, because it means you won't be criticising anybody in government. But there is a situation, for those who don't know the film, they want to launch a drone strike, and they have all the evidence, don't they? They have all the intelligence is coming in through video feeds. Is it Helen Mirren who's the lead actress?
That's it, yeah.
She's terribly good. But of course, the piece of evidence they don't have is the one about human compassion. So, do they kill the terrorist and the child, or what do they do? It's a very difficult situation. It's almost a sort of King Solomon's choice, isn't it? I mean, would you say in that situation, and people may extrapolate from that, you are criticising government as well, that the MOD, that the people in that film are not making evidence-based decisions, or they could be making more evidence-based decisions? Is that the thrust of what you're saying?
No, I don't think I am, and perhaps I explained myself poorly. I think that with this complex and data-rich world that we're living in, the risk is not that the wrong decisions of the moment are made, because I'm relatively confident that those at the tactical lead and at the operational lead will have information. I mean, we can come back to that, because I have some worries there, but that's a separate point. My worry is that those with custody of our strategic direction get drawn into that which can be measured. And therefore, there's a vacuum in strategic understanding and strategic thinking. It's not that they make that the wrong decision is made in that instance, to pick your Eye in the Sky. It is that actually that might be the right decision, but there's been so much fixation on that data and on that information that it distracts us from properly, as a country and as a department, thinking strategically.
Are you saying, like Geoffrey Palmer in James Bond playing the wonderful Admiral who opens fire on the baddie from the ship, let's do this the old-fashioned way? Is that what you mean?
No, we're stretching our cinematic
we are a bit,
here.
yes.
So quite the opposite. I think that we just your question comes because I explained what I wanted to do with the Tony Blair Institute, which was strategic leaders need the tools to think strategically. And in my mind, at the moment, the vast majority of data tools are looking to support the tactical and the operational level of command. And the risk is that those strategic leaders dip down into there, which is fine on occasions, but mustn't be at the expense of proper strategic thinking. Now, I'll caveat that by saying that actually, if you look at the integrated review and its conclusion, it was a proper strategic paper. I mean, I've got my views of how ambitious it was, and I think it should have been, I think it's still a very traditional review with lots of shipbuilding and metal bending, but it was strategic. So that's the exception that proves my thing.
So that's an example where it works. And just for the benefit of people who don't know, just tell me what the integrated review is.
Well, so the integrated review was once every Parliament strategic assessment of where this country should be looking. And it started, these things started as defence reviews and are now looking quite rightly far more broadly across our foreign policy, security and defence and development structure. And it was, the financial settlement was published in the latter part of last year, and the review itself was published earlier this year with a defence command paper, which sets out how it will be delivered shortly after that review.
And broadly speaking, what does it recommend this time that's unusual?
Well, I think for our listeners, the majority of whom won't have had the military career in the sort of latter part of the last century that I've got, what I would say they would see as unusual is it's moving from counter-terrorism, counter-extremism as the major threat to a return to great power competition. Within that, it rightly acknowledges Russia as that pacing threat. But for the first time, it sees China as a competitive adversary. So in strategic terms, that's what I would say to your listeners is probably the most unusual element.
It's set up for the first time in a long time. It says more ships, doesn't it?
Yes, and that's where I'd say it's ex-Admiral. Of course, I'd love to see more ships, but that's where I'd say it was less ambitious, because I really think that there should have been a greater pivot towards the technology that will really sustain or allow us to regain our edge against our peer adversaries. So the digitization space, cyberspace, rather than bending more metal, to use the vernacular.
Okay, in a minute I'm going to talk to TechVets Chief Executive James Murphy about what you've been talking about. So we'll come back to technology at the end of this chat. But I just want to pick up the last bit, which is your work for Rebellion Defence. What's that?
So Rebellion Defence was set up by three visionary individuals on both sides of the Atlantic. We're a US-UK company, so we develop software, AI, ML software on both sides of the Atlantic. We've got our headquarters, UK headquarters in London, our US headquarters in Washington. It was set up in July 19, in part because the Department of Defense and vicariously the Ministry of Defense got scared when a program called the JEDI program in America, which was a Google program, stopped because the Google employees wrote an open letter saying this doesn't align with our principles. And both departments realized that if they were to maintain an edge against and deter adversaries, they needed cutting edge technology that could only come from the brilliant technologists that you get in the Googles and the Twitters and the Apples of this world. And if they couldn't be guaranteed and assured, then someone else needed to step into the van. So we've stepped up, and we've been coming up for 2 years to deliver world-beating software to the US and the UK. And we draw in engineers from some of those globally iconic software houses. Our head of engineering in the UK, who is joining us in a month, is currently head of engineering for WhatsApp in the UK. Our head of engineering in the US put Netflix on the cloud. One of our other engineers was one of the first 10 engineers in Amazon, then one of the first 10 engineers in LinkedIn and Twitter. So we've got engineers that have got the authority. They know how to grow a software company from a garage to a global name.
It sounds disruptive, the name Rebellion Defence. I mean, is it consciously trying to adapt to or adopt part of the internet media mainstream, because you have a problem in some ways that, a lot of Google staff say they don't want to do this kind of work. You I guess, have found the ones who do.
I mean, the name is catchy and everyone remembers it. So, first thing, that's great. Secondly, whilst we believe that things need to change within defence, particularly with software, and therefore, when people ask us what are rebellions about, it is that defence, and all of your listeners will recognise this, defence deserves better software than a software that was designed 30 years ago, delivered 20 years ago, and unchanged. So just let me give you an example. There was a huge announcement. There was an announcement 2 days ago that the Joint Personnel Administration software that manages all of our, sailors, soldiers, and aviators reports has now got a spell check in it. As of this week. I mean, that's fundamentally so. And if that's the case for our administrative software, then we have certainly not got the evergreen. So we are not rebelling, but we are wanting to see, we are demanding change, and we are demanding to support that change. I think the element of rebellion that we have, particularly within the software industry, is that we absolutely have at our heart the belief that defense should have open architecture, open APIs, and an ecosystem where those on both sides of the Atlantic get to exploit software from a broad collection of software developers and software companies, some of whom will be the big primes, many of whom will be far smaller, because otherwise we will not be able to exploit data at the pace that we want to. So there is a sort of an inclusivity about that rebellion that might be lost. You know, we're not after one ring to rule them all. We are after a change that enables the warfighters who are listening to this podcast now to get the best software and exploit the depth and breadth of data that they're currently unable to do.
Okay, to ask, not to ask you to be immodest, but there's something about what you just said about the disruptive nature of rebellion that's not disruptive, that is trying to get to a better end, but is unafraid to say this is wrong and that is wrong. That also seems to be a kind of marker for your own career throughout, especially in latter years, but really since 1986 when you joined the Royal Navy. Is that what you would like to be seen as? Is that I'm trying to find a way of asking you, who are British, to say yes, I'm really good, but I know you don't want to say that.
Yeah, because it's not true. I mean, look, we all of us have flaws and strengths, and quite frequently, you know, your flaw can subsequently be seen as a strength. So if we go back to the unpleasantness surrounding the tweet and the subsequent article by Richard Littlejohn, you know, many would say that came from a flaw that Burton has, which is he's impetuous and impulsive. You know, as I said right from the start, I'm unashamed of that. I think I'm not going to respond. I'm not going to respond to your question of how good are you, Alex, because that's for others to judge. But I do think that that what you draw out for your listeners is a really important point, which is we all come, if the listeners are military people, we all grow up in an institution and we're all formed by that institution, and we are extraordinarily proud of it and are very grateful for it. But we are individuals, and the strength that we offer on the outside when you go into that second career is as much your own character as it is the values you gain from the institution that you've come from. So to answer your question, I have always tried to be true to what my beliefs are, which is an inclusivity and treating people as individuals and shouting out when things are wrong, but trying to work with people to right those wrongs rather than just rail against them.
Alex Burton, thank you very much. Great, James. He covered a great deal of ground there. And I think the first thing to establish is, what does TechVets do with Rebellion? Do you work with them at all?
We don't work with them, but Alex is a big fan. So, he's been a fantastic support. So he's always willing to help out and support where he can. So, for example, we had a really good planning session that we had booked, and I couldn't land an office space in Mountborough House at RFEA. So, clearly I then go to my black book with a number of people that have offered support, and Alex was front and center, and straight away got back to me and said, look, come and jump into one of our offices. And it was fantastic. And it's literally, you walk out their front door, cross the road. If you walk in a straight line across the road, you walk into the wall 2 meters to the left of MOD main building, which was fantastic.
I mean, he comes from a very different time, but he is, of course, modern in his outlook. How would you compare those two things?
I mean, I think at the moment we're seeing far more people coming through the military and out the other side who are increasingly modern in their approach. They understand the importance of technology. They understand the importance of data and the use of data and having digital skills. Again, there's a lot of people that are starting to understand the importance of increased technology, the efficiency that it brings, and the capability development that could be implemented within their roles when they're leaving the military. And some, yes, they also see a frustration. But to be honest, I think that the key points that Alex made there, which was actually certainly relevant for me, but many others, is that yes, you're absolutely forged within that institution. and what that brings you as a sort of core development of your sort of soft skills and character traits tends to be those really sort of employable features when you leave. But actually what really helps is that individuality, that character that you have, that you develop yourself over those years, that can't be directed by the military. That's something that's far more personal.
Yeah, there was something quite kind of energetic about him all the way through. You know, he's always slightly on the edge of his seat and telling you stuff. Is it that kind of attitude that you want to see, that you would like to see in people going through TechVets? Because I mean, you know, as a civilian, I interview people who are arms folded, you know, hunched in their seats, not interviewing terribly well. It seemed to me Alex was the opposite of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you tend to find is that employers are really enjoying the fact that you've got military people leaving who are so passionate, so driven, and so excited about the next challenge. And they see a challenge as exactly that. And I suppose the one point that Alex made within that regard as well was that he is ever the optimist. And again, it's seeing these people that are leaving the military, especially with something like COVID, especially as a changing way of working. Actually, we're seeing a lot of people coming through TechVets, landing roles. They've never met their team, but they take it in their stride and they see it as something else that they need to get through. And that positive approach is something that helps you throughout your whole military career, especially when you're on arduous operations, where lives are in danger, where you're not seeing your families for long periods of time. And you have to see the positives through that for your own mental health, I suppose, beyond anything else.
Just one more question about Alex's character. So he seems to me to be the opposite of the kind of fusty Sir Joseph Porter KCB from Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore, who gets the job because he started at W.H. Smith. He's not that kind of admiral by any means. I didn't ask him the question. He might have said that there was still a place for that kind of person. Is there, your end, when you're putting people into jobs, is there a place for somebody with very traditional ideas? How disruptive do they have to be to work in tech? How kind of obviously, consciously unmainstream in a way do they have to be?
There are still roles in certainly those organisations that are, those individuals going to organisations turning around and working with defence, and sometimes there is definitely a place for them with those more traditional, traits. I would argue, though, that actually that's not a positive. And what Alex displays, his exceptional experience that he has, was also the fantastic ability to modernise relevant to what was happening around him and what was potentially coming ahead as well. And his discussion about looking forward and having that strategic vision beyond the operational and tactical is something that is so important. But actually what you're seeing is that is happening. Sandhurst is a particularly great institution for training officers, and the officers that we're getting now are particularly forward-thinking, dynamic individuals who are leading in the right way. You don't have the traditional leadership methodologies being implemented at the operational level, and strategically people are starting to engage a little bit more in modern. I suppose we can use our own organisation because as a programme within RFEA, I'm working on a daily basis with Alistair Halliday, who's an ex-1 star, who's doing phenomenal things and quite dynamic in a charity where everyone can work remotely. They're digitized. Their use of data is exceptional, and this is because we've got someone who has that military mindset, but is really focused on how to evolve and how to develop.
What about the idea we talked about of taking time off from your service career in order to go into the private sector and then coming back to your service career afterwards?
Phenomenal, and that's something that I'm really, really pleased that he spoke about, and we're quite aligned on that. Let's make a comparison here with non-military careers and military careers. In the military, you join the military, and it's an institution, but you're working in essence in one company. And whilst you may have a real variation in what you do, it's all towards one mission. People in non-military roles will move around a lot more. And even if it's in the same sort of vertical career path, they're moving from company to company to achieve that. And the difference there is that you're getting more diversity of experience. I think what would be really great is for military to really be able to bring that sort of capability back into the fold by getting people out the door, seeing what's working. And what you'll also see, though, is a benefit for businesses who are bringing these individuals into their teams. They will see the bonus of having these people with exceptional leadership skills, teamwork, motivation, drive, and as well as all the other procedural stuff. So a really, really strong point.
I mean, it's speculation, but is there a role for TechVets in this kind of move from government job to private job to government job again?
Yes, and actually away from MOD and in wider government, actually quite often you see civil service members who start in the civil service. They do some fantastic work, but then they move on. And then once they've gained a bit more experience, they come back into a more senior role within the civil service. And that gives, again, a great flavour of diverse experience. I think, yes, TechVets has a really strong role to play because we enable people to network deep into industries, all sectors where tech and cyber is involved. So people can make those moves as long as there is the facility and capacity in place for the MOD to support that.
If you're a serving personnel listening to this, thinking about how TechVets might be able to help me, what would you take away from the chat we had with Alex? What kind of overall is the advice you take from that discussion that will help you get your job in the future? And don't say start by being an admiral.
Yeah, well, actually, I think the point that he made on that is probably the most important, that it doesn't really matter where you come from. When you leave the military, if you're making a career change, you have to be prepared to go back to being a learner. And I think this is a point that I make so many times when people, yes, that imposter syndrome exists, but people use that term sometimes a bit too freely. And when they're leaving the military and moving into quite a different career path, they have to give themselves time to really start learning again. After a few years of learning, what best practice is, they will become the practitioners that are delivering best practice. And again, after a few more years after that, however many years it takes, they then become the experts who are helping industries shape best practice. But there has to be an understanding and a level of patience involved there. But again, the other point he made, you've got to be tenacious. You've got to go after it. Don't worry too much about the salary. That will work its way through eventually. But again, strong military background, use your character traits that you have that are personable, and really drive for what you want in order to succeed, but really understand the benefits in the future of technology and how a career in technology and cyber is a really sustainable and thoroughly enjoyable one.
He set great store by the training he received whilst in the Royal Navy. Would you say that is important to put across to people? Get every available training you can.
Oh, 100%. And I think there is some fantastic resources available now for serving persons for cybersecurity and technology training, distance learning that's available. They have to apply for it, but it is there. And that is an appreciation now that's starting to manifest, which is quite nice to see. But yes, you're getting more training, but more personal development than anyone else outside of the military. And the real strong aspect of this is that nearly all the training that the MOD provides at the individual level is developing the core soft skills that are going to be invaluable for them when they leave. The values and standards, the ability to be dynamic, to be composed under pressure in the face of quite rapid change, and being a robust individual who can also employ critical thought and really problem-solving elements to what are increasingly complex times in cybersecurity.
Thank you, James, and thanks also to Alex Burton. There's some really great anecdotes and insights during this chat. I think for me, what stands out is the importance of being yourself when you are looking for a job outside the military, and being strong, being outgoing as well. And no doubt, Alex and James's advice will resonate with our listeners. For our listeners, you can find out more about TechVets and how to become a member by visiting techvets.co or searching for TechVets on LinkedIn. If you are a business owner or work for a company in the tech industry and want to find out how to get more veterans into your team, drop James Murphy a message via LinkedIn. You'll find all the contacts you need in the description for this post. We'll be back next month with another TechVets podcast. Thanks for joining us.